Hello everybody, you're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host Dane Cobain. This is the weekly radio show where we chat about the local arts news. We have a different guest on each week. We head over to the Rhylight Zone for some poetry and or some fiction. We have an album review from Twangling Jack Ford. And of course we share lots of local unsigned and independent music. As always, you can reach out to me here at the studio by dropping me an email on dane.cobain@wickhamsound.org.uk. That's dane.cobain@wickhamsound.org.uk. And I particularly want to hear from poets, musicians, performers, anybody who thinks they would make a good guest for the show. You can also find us on Facebook if you search for The Art Show on Wickham Sound, and we're repeated here on Wickham Sound on Monday nights. You can catch up on the Listen Again on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever else you get your podcasts. So this week we are going to be chatting to composer John Buttigieg. I think that's how you say his name. I've only seen it written down. So we're going to go ahead and head over to the Rhylight Zone for this week's short story. And this is Poor Old Ida Wilkins by Say Kevy. Kevy is a fantastic YouTuber, and I've been watching her content for a while now. She's been doing some fantastic original short stories recently, and this is just one of them. So go ahead and check it out.
Poor Old Ida Wilkins. 1. August. Poor old Ida Wilkins has been alone ever since her husband passed away 24 years ago. The dear thing never had any visitors, and her landline only rung when a telemarketer gave a call. Ida Wilkins was alone in the world. Sure, she would engage with employees at the local market, but that was the extent of her human interaction for many, many years. You may suppose this would make her cold, but no, poor old Ida never lost her sweet charm. She may hardly remember the faces of the people she speaks to every day on her errands, but they remember her. But their relationship with her ends at the door of the establishment. Nobody truly loved Ida Wilkins. Ida's home is a simple home, and it hasn't changed in the past 24 years. When she arrives home from her daily errands, she leaves her key in a tray beside the door. The door opens directly into her living room, furnished with a couch and 2 chairs facing a small television, though Ida only ever sits in the navy blue recliner. Adjacent to the living room is a dining room, no longer used. The table and chairs are still there, but have been untouched for years. There's probably a layer of dust covering it, but with Ida's failing eyesight she'll never notice. Through the dining room is her kitchen, where a small table and a single chair resided, where Ida has eaten her meals for the past 2 and change decades. In the very back of the house is her bedroom, once shared with her husband. Since his death, she has never bothered to pack away his things. He still has his own dresser and half of the closet, but his side of the bed remains untouched. Poor old Ida Wilkins. Every morning, the little woman gets out of bed before the sun has finished rising. Walking at a speed rivaling the fabled tortoise, head gently shaking against the strain of being held up, Ida dresses herself and has a bowl of cereal. She does not shower very often. For being alone and arthritic, the exertion of bathing is just not worth it. After breakfast, she goes to the mall. She couldn't tell you a single store in the shopping center, apart from the Macy's where she enters, and the JCPenney with the good bathrooms. She just goes there to walk. An hour passes before she reaches the far end of the mall, where she grabs a seat at the food court to rest. Another hour, and she's shuffling through the door at Macy's on her way back home. Whenever she needs groceries or whatever, she makes that stop at this point. And by the time she gets home, it's barely noon. Ida spends the rest of her day, every day, in that navy blue recliner, watching Wheel of Fortune and other game show reruns she has seen a dozen times but doesn't remember, before retiring to her bedroom no later than 7. Yes, for 24 years, Ida has lived this quiet, simple life. You would think that any deviation from what she has grown accustomed to would garner suspicions. But no, poor old Ida Wilkins never suspected a thing. The first time Ida should have suspected something was in late August. She had just gotten home from her daily trip to the mall and plopped herself in her usual seat. Reaching for the remote, It surprised her that it was not in its usual place. Rather than resting atop the armrest on her recliner, the remote had relocated to the couch. She snatched it up and started the television. The sound of a football game sent her mind back 24 years to the last time she had heard this sound. Not much had changed in sports media since she had last seen it, much like her game show reruns. She remembered the announcer, could distinctly hear his voice in her mind, although she had no clue who he was. She remembered hearing it while she was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for her and Hank. He used to love those sports, with the teams and such. He was so happy when they won. She made a pork roast, with mashed potatoes and green beans. Ida set the dining room table and made their plates. Then as she sat, Ida called to her husband, "Hank, come eat." Hank did not respond. He would get so focused when the game was on. She called again. "You can keep it on, but you gotta come eat before it gets cold." Hank still did not reply. Feeling irritated at her husband's behavior, and not suspecting anything out of the ordinary, she called out to him one last time. "Well, fine. I'm gonna get started. You can reheat it if it gets cold." So she ate. It was adequate, no better or worse than any other dinner she made. When she had finished and his plate had gotten cold, she finally went to confront him, and found, to no one's surprise but her own, that her husband was dead. Hank had passed during the first quarter of the game, and even though it was then in overtime, she never realized anything was off. In the same way, Ida now switched her television back to her game shows, failing to realize the significance of the channel having changed in the first place. 2. September. Weeks passed, and Ida's routine was unchanged. This incident in August was all but forgotten, a memory as faded as her husband Hank. One day, however, there was a hiccup in her ritual. As the bus pulled up to the mall, she saw the entire entrance was blocked by protesters. What they were protesting, she did not give a damn. She was old and perpetually tired and couldn't be bothered to push her way through the ruckus. So she stayed on board and took the bus right back home. Perhaps her presence could have done something. Or maybe if she cared more, she could have helped out their cause. But no, she'd rather sit at home with her game shows. When she arrived home, hours before her usual return, she caught an aroma in the air. Her nostrils filled with the warm, soothing aroma of her sweet potato casserole. Ida stood there, just inside her front door, resting her hand against the wall as the fragrance transported her to an evening with Hank nearly 30 years ago. It was a special occasion, and Hank always requested sweet potatoes on special occasions. Now Ida makes them whenever. They lost their meaning when she lost Hank. As the dream lifted, and Ida found herself back in the present, it finally occurred to her that she shouldn't be smelling this scent. She had made the sweet potatoes nearly a week ago, and the leftovers were still in the fridge. Despite only cooking for one, she never adjusted her recipe, and made much more than she needed. Then it clicked. Some potatoes must have just spilled on the bottom of the oven, which, when reheated, would once again cause the fragrance to permeate the air. She swiftly, well, as swiftly as that poor old thing could, hobbled into the kitchen and turned the oven off. It never occurred to Ida that she hadn't left the oven on. She simply turned it off and wandered back to her bedroom for a nap. Nor did she bother to check whether or not the oven was empty. But it would be by the time she prepared dinner that evening. As the oven cooled and Ida closed her eyes, she let out the quietest wail. "Oh, Hank." 3. October. Dear old Ida Wilkins was never one for Halloween. If a child knocked at her home, by the time she got out of her chair and walked to the door and opened it, the kid would be 3 houses down. She preferred to just leave a bowl of candy on her doorstep. That's how Hank did it, and it made the night a little easier. She went to bed by 7, long before the trick-or-treaters had gone home. Since she had no direct interaction with them, there was no reason to wait up. Let the kids keep coming till the bowl runs out. Hopefully they wouldn't take the bowl. At least, not again. While she slept, Ida dreamt of trick-or-treating in her childhood. She was dressed as a snow fairy, with a stick in one hand for a wand and a pillowcase in the other to collect candy. In her dream, young Ida was trick-or-treating outside old Ida's own home. The bowl was empty. She approached the door, tapped 3 times with her stick, and waited. Shortly, the lock turned. But when the door opened, she was greeted by a stranger, a man she had never seen before, face shrouded in darkness. He almost resembled her husband Hank when he was younger. The surprise of this encounter jolted her awake, and she realized she had to pee. The older Ida has gotten, the more frequently she has to go, and she can't hold it like she used to. She got out of bed and headed into the hallway toward the bathroom. It was quite dark, and Ida can only see the vaguest shapes. But she was able to find her way in no time. Well, in some time. In the darkness, time seemed to move slower, and at Ida's pace, even a quick trip to the bathroom could take a while. When she finally re-emerged, something caught her attention. She was not sure what she saw, if she even saw anything, but there seemed to be a large, vague shape, taking up space in the dark hallway opposite her bedroom. Ida stared toward the shape for some minutes, till she concluded that the dream she had awoken from must have been making her see things. She turned away from the shadow and returned to bed. After Ida was tucked back into bed and long asleep, the shadow she had seen finally began to move. It went to the kitchen, where in the morning Ida would find her candy bowl, already brought in, waiting for her on her little table. 4. November. Thanksgiving was always a difficult time for poor old Ida Wilkins. This season is a time to be with family, and Ida had none. At the mall, she would sit and watch the families pass by, imagining all the wonderful things they would enjoy for Thanksgiving dinner, all the family and friends they would invite. Sometimes, she would even imagine herself at their table, and for a brief moment, feeling she wasn't so lonely. Then she would lose sight of them, and the illusion was broken. No, Ida Wilkins would spend Thanksgiving just as she spent every day, alone. Ida began cooking Thanksgiving dinner at the reasonable hour of 8 o'clock in the morning. Even though she was cooking for one, she bought an entire turkey. While that cooked in the oven, she prepared corn and mac and cheese on the stovetop. When the turkey came out, she finished her Thanksgiving prep by browning a few biscuits. She would have leftovers for weeks. Ida fixed herself up a plate and sat in front of her television. Thanksgiving was the one occasion when she wouldn't watch her game shows. First, there was the parade, then the Bozo, Gar and Ray special on WGN. This special showed all the TV shows from her childhood and allowed her mind to travel back to simpler, less lonesome times with her favorite television characters. Ida doesn't remember much nowadays, but these programs hold a very special place in her heart. She could have seen that the television special had been set to record as well, but that technology was beyond her. Anything more than changing the channel or adjusting the volume was lost on silly old Ida Wilkins. When the show was over and Ida had finished her feast, she returned with her empty plate to the kitchen. But before she put her dishes away, Ida grabbed a clean plate from the cupboard and loaded it with turkey, corn, mac, and a biscuit. She left this plate, along with a napkin and silverware, at the head of the dining room table, then proceeded to clean up and go to bed. The next morning, the plate was empty. 5. December. From that day forward, Ida always cooked enough for 2. She'd leave the second plate in the dining room and clean up an empty plate in the morning. Ida never thought to question this new behavior, or to ponder who or what was eating from her plates. She was just glad to have someone to cook for her again. As Christmas approached, Ida looked forward to a holiday for the first time in 24 years. She would cook an entire holiday feast, like she used to prepare for Hank, all those many years ago. All of her decorations were long gone, but she picked up a few new items to give her home a festive vibe. Ida even wrapped a present, a pipe like Hank used to smoke. She hoped he would like it. On Christmas Eve, Ida was buzzing with excitement. She knew this would be a special day. She even wore some drugstore mascara and a spritz of her old perfume that she hadn't touched in a decade. Poor old Ida did whatever she could to make herself feel young and beautiful again. She only had a light dinner that night, saving her stomach and her energy for the feast to come the next day. As the Jeopardy tune filled her home, Ida hardly noticed the game show on the screen. Her mind was racing. For the first time in decades, she had something to look forward to. After dinner, she went to bed, but she didn't fall asleep. Like a child, she stayed awake, eager in anticipation of her nighttime visitor. Unlike Santa Claus, her spirit was really there. She just hoped she could keep awake long enough to hear him. Just as she was starting to doze off, she heard a sound in the kitchen. Silverware, then mastication. He was here. Ida listened to the sounds of chewing for several minutes, until the sounds were replaced by silence. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over the bed from the doorway. Ida cleared her throat as an indication that she was awake, and an invitation for him to come in. She didn't move. She didn't look. She just laid there, in anticipation. The dark figure moved from the doorway to the bed. He lifted the covers, climbed into bed behind her, and wrapped his arms around her. As he fell asleep, he could just hear a faint whisper. Hank. 6. Christmas. Christmas morning, Ida woke up, and for the first time looked at her intruder. The moment she laid her eyes on me, I knew she felt the same way I did. All these months I've lived with her, admiring her from shadows and closets, my love growing ever deeper. It broke my heart seeing how lonely she was. She needed my company as much as I needed hers. Ida looked at me and smiled, comforted in knowing she was no longer alone. She has a companion. With a new spring in her step, she snuck out of bed and got quick to work preparing our breakfast. Oh, it was delicious. Eating beside the woman I love, sharing her table, filled me with unparalleled pleasure. Ida's gone back to our bed, waiting for me to finish my eggs before we consummate our new relationship.
Alright, that was Poor Old Ida Wilkins by Say Kevy as part of this week's Rhylight Zone. This is The Weight of Words by Silverback.
Took you to the coast, took you sugar and
That was Bleak by John Buttigieg, and before that we had The Weight of Words by Silverbacks. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain, and it's time for this week's guest to join us, and it is the man himself, John Buttigieg, so over to him. What was the last book that you read, and what did you think of it?
Well, Dane, you're more likely to find me at the piano rather than immersed in a book, although I do dip into a good read now and again. So, the most recent would be Never Let Me Go by Ishiguro. So well written and such a haunting premise. It's certainly for those who enjoy a dystopian journey. Mind-bending, surreal, and such imagination from the author. It's certainly one that stays with you. I won't say more at the risk of spoiling it for other readers, though.
How did you get into composing, and how long have you been writing music?
From as early as I can remember. I always had a piano or keyboard at hand. My music teacher during primary school, Chris Rowan, also helped me to tap into my innate musicality. In fact, I had the opportunity to play compositions at school during summer concerts. I also experimented with various sounds, harmonies, rhythms, and chord progressions on keyboards. I must have been around 5 years old when I started. A-level music was more performance-oriented, however, I started to compose again in my 20s, focusing more on solo piano. Now I also really enjoy the mix of piano and synth. I'm also looking forward to exploring new instrumentation and hopefully collaborating with other artists in the near future. It should be really, really exciting. So yes, I've been composing music since I was a child. I started writing scores later on.
So we talked a little bit about how we both suffer from anxiety. Would you be willing to share a little bit of your story?
First off, Dane, thank you for opening the floor to a discussion about mental health. There is still so much work to do with regards to reducing stigma and helping individuals to feel comfortable opening up about this. So yes, of course, I'm willing to share some of my experiences in this arena. Even as I say what I'm saying, I must disclose that I'm lucky to be functioning and, dare I say, alive. I've experienced generalised anxiety disorder as well as severe OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, since I was about 6. OCD is unbelievably debilitating. These struggles then led to very significant depression and, with other events in my life, to trauma. Unfortunately, due to medical malpractice abroad and a fair amount of misinformation, I was prescribed a massive dose of benzodiazepines daily, the withdrawal symptoms of which led me to hospitalisation. Even though I tried to come off the drug very, very slowly, I cannot articulate in words the constant terror and pain. I'm grateful to be alive, Dane. I never ever thought I would make it, sincerely. A shout out to all those suffering with any similar issues. Believe me, I empathise with your pain. That brings to mind something I posted online recently. I felt compelled to spell out this message, so I'll just share it. Let's try and end mental health stigma once and for all. While I don't let it define my personhood, it's something I have to manage chronically, and it can be a rough journey, understatement. Hopefully, we can one day understand that behind many of the smiles around on social media, there is also a mass amount of suffering. We are blinded by a gloss of okayness.
Do you ever perform live, or does your anxiety prohibit that?
Yeah, I do perform live, however, I prefer not to. It's not that my anxiety prohibits it per se, it's that I experience a great amount of anticipatory angst weeks before a concert, like many artists do, I imagine. We're talking about solo performance here. Within a group, I'm oftentimes surprised at how relaxed I'm performing, especially if the music has some element of improvisation to it. Well, relatively relaxed, let's say. Despite the anxiety, and perhaps dare I say because of it sometimes, I love the way in which I can express myself during a performance while sharing emotional states with the audience. In this way, I can give a part of my being that goes far beyond the way words would ever work for me.
What are your thoughts on music as a form of self-expression and a source of healing?
Excellent question, and one which would take a long response to do justice. However, no fear, I'll make it short and sweet. I believe that sound in many of its forms can offer healing. Moreover, music therapy can also be very, very beneficial. In this case, Dane, the client and therapist will improvise together, attuning to one another to work towards various goals, and these can be musical and non-musical. So, this helps in many cases. Let me give you an example. A child with autism working towards self-expression might find new avenues of communication. Another example, Dane, a dementia sufferer may discover a sense of emotional containment and togetherness, and this can enable the individual concerned to hold on to and even improve motor skills and memory.
So it was Chopin who really helped you to fall in love with music. What is it about Chopin's music that draws you to it?
Oh, the pure beauty of it. I found it quite by chance when I came across an old cassette belonging to my dad with a selection of Chopin's works. Dane and I experienced such a great resonance with the pieces that I would listen to them over and over again, sometimes to the point of tears and ecstasy. So we could talk about the harmonies and the structure Chopin uses, and I do find these fascinating to explore. However, I will leave that in the hands of specialists on Chopin. These structures that we're talking about all make up a musical output greater than the sum of all the components, in my opinion, creating a beautiful experience for the listener. So, if I had to say anything specific about Chopin's music, I would say that it is the mixture of intense suffering and also peace that can be found within it. And this really drew me to it and helped me to fall in love with the music. It's honestly sublime, and I would highly recommend it.
Other than Chopin, who are some of the other composers whose work you adore?
Well, alongside Chopin, for me is Rachmaninoff, of which I love his concerti and works for two pianos. He's different to Chopin, but also very giving in his music, exploring more modern harmonies. In the mix, I could add Bach and Beethoven too, of course, along with so many more. I'll add here that aside from classical, I'm a big fan of Richard Ashcroft's music, as well as that of the band Europe, and I must say I feel that their music is sadly unrepresented in the mainstream playlists. They have some beautiful tracks. I also really like jazz, especially Oscar Peterson's work.
You're listening to The Archer on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain. I'm here in conversation with John Buttigieg. We're chatting music and stuff. We're going to listen to one of his tunes now. This is Glacial. That was Glacial by John Buttigieg. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain. I'm here in conversation with the man himself. Over to John. What can you tell us about your time in Malta? Who did you take lessons with, and do you take any influence from Maltese music into your own work?
Okay, I spent time in Malta on and off throughout my 20s. It was one of mixed experiences, I'd say. Some of them were quite positive. Regardless, I had the pleasure of being taught by an excellent pianist, Julian Dyson, who was residing in Malta at the time, luckily. So, really wonderful chap and an excellent musician. He helped me to understand the true nature of piano, I'd say, and its nuanced sounds and resonance. We also had good fun exploring some of my compositional work. At the time, this was a suite for piano made up of 4 pieces entitled Uncharted. I also worked with Rosetta Di Battista, a true musician in every sense of the word, as well as a trained music therapist. So far I've not been explicitly aware of any particular Maltese influence in my work, but who knows what the subconscious can bring out artistically. To be honest, Dane, this question really got me thinking, and I'll endeavour to explore any Maltese cultural influence within my Maltese identity now. By the way, there's a great Maltese composer, Charles Camilleri, whose work is really good, and I feel eager to explore more of his pieces after thinking about this question.
So you've completed degrees in philosophy and psychology as well as music therapy. Do those degrees have any influence on your music?
Okay, yes. The answer is yes, of course, because ultimately all experiences have some impact upon an artist, I believe. So, say, the depth of thought within the disciplines of philosophy and psychology certainly opened up my mind to new ideas which translated into music. I will say, Dane, though, that it's more of a holistic processing which manifests musically rather than a particular piece of writing or literature that gives me inspiration. My MA in music therapy had the most tangible influence upon my art, I think. Specifically, it gave me an even greater appreciation of spontaneous music making, which is where I feel that I'm in my element. Within the course, there was also an intriguing discourse about the links between music and psychotherapy, as well as its influence upon the brain. The course really enabled me to view music as a phenomenon which affects us as human beings in so many more ways than I could previously have envisaged.
You have a whole bunch of albums out. Do you have a favourite out of them?
Well, it would be impossible to say which of my albums is my favourite. Some might have favourites. However, I do have an affinity to certain individual tracks. I find something particularly special in the tracks Glacial and Voyage from my album Perspectives, and the track Desolate from the album entitled Fractured. Another one would be, for example, a piece which I called Chase from my Enigma album. So, while I do think that each individual album certainly holds up to a particular theme, I believe that each individual piece has something to say in its own right. Other artists might also resonate with this.
How do you record your music? Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, of course. I can share a little bit about my recording process and how I do that in general. So sometimes I mic up an acoustic piano. Other times I use very good sampled instruments. On other occasions, I go into the studio with my publishers to render or master a track as professionally as possible. Yeah, I always prefer the sound of acoustic instruments, to be honest, especially piano. Sometimes it really isn't practical to record in this manner, so there has to be a compromise. Whatever the recording method, I thoroughly enjoy fine-tuning any sounds and music that I ultimately produce. So something else, let's see. I use a mixture of software to produce my recordings. I need some programs, let's say, to process the raw acoustic sounds, say from a mic'd up instrument, whilst others are more useful, other programs, for working with MIDI data and mastering. So, I hope this gives you some insight into how I record, basically.
When you write, do you write by ear, and do you ever score out your work?
Okay, so, in terms of writing, it really is a mixed bag for me. I prefer composing by ear, as this just comes more naturally to me, to be honest. But I do also score certain pieces which require it, such as the suite for piano, which I mentioned before. Whatever the case, I tend to work on the scoring after completing the compositional ideas. That's just generally how I roll.
How important is music when it comes to movies, and do you find yourself listening to the music as much as you watch the movie?
Right. In my humble opinion, music is quite essential to film. Although, of course, I cannot speak for all productions. So, I would say that it adds such a depth and feeling to a particular scene, or even to the film as a whole. Often it's the music from a film which I personally treasure the most, Dane. Although, because the soundtrack is so strongly and intrinsically paired with the script, I don't know, it's sometimes hard to see them as separate entities. I don't know if you can resonate with me on that. All that being said, I believe that we can ultimately appreciate film music without watching said films, or even after having watched the film. So yes, to answer your question more directly, I most definitely find myself listening to the music as much, if not more than actually, the screenplay itself. I can give you a recent example if you like. I really love the original Total Recall film directed by Paul Verhoeven. The music's by Jerry Goldsmith. So I was watching it recently and I found that the various themes within the score add to the enigma of the film's plot, and I found this absolutely fascinating. And I must add that the music is beautifully composed too.
How do you know the pirate captain and fantasy author, as well as previous guest on the art show, Carl Snook?
Well, I got to know Carl Snook through our mutual love of music. He's a great guy with a wonderful imagination, determination, and creative output. Honestly. It's a real pleasure to know him. Also, we're considering, and hopefully it will materialise, working on an album together. And this will be fantastic because with our joint efforts, there's the potential for some beautiful music to be made. I really enjoy chatting with him about his wrestling career and graphic design work. He's a pro in these arenas. I admire his stuff. We've maintained a really good friendship, and I'm extremely thankful for this.
And finally, another question we ask everybody, which is, what's next for you, and where can people go to find out more?
Sure. Up next for me is an album of piano and synth, which I'm preparing to work on shortly. Dane, my music can be found on SoundCloud and Instagram under the username John C. Buttigieg. One word. And I'll just spell my surname for you. It's Buttigieg. My stuff can also be found via my publisher's site, Monkey Puzzle House Production Music. Furthermore, just a quick internet search of John C. Buttigieg or John Buttigieg Piano will bring up a link to my personal site. And I'd like to really thank you, Dane, for having me on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Cheers.
Big thank you to John Buttigieg for joining me. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain, and this is another one of John's tunes. This is Obsession.
baby don't care for clothes. My baby just cares for me. My baby don't care for cars and races. My baby don't care for high-tone places. Lit sailor is not his style, and even Lana Turner's smile is something he can see. My baby don't care, oh no, my baby just cares for me. He don't care for high-tone places. Lit sailor is not his style, and even Lana Turner's smile is something he can see. Is something he can see. I wonder what's wrong with baby. My baby just cares for. My baby just cares for. My baby just cares for me.
Alright, that was Betty Accorsi with her version of Nina Simone's My Baby Just Cares For Me. Before that we had Obsession by John Buttigieg. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain, and it's time to head over to the Oak Shed for this week's album review from Twangling Jack Ford.
Nina Simone, the very best of. Eunice Kathleen Wayman wanted to be a classical pianist, but being a woman of colour stopped her. That rejection and the anger she felt fired up her whole career in jazz and soul music. She was a fantastic pianist and interpreter of material. She took the little-known Anthony Newley song Feeling Good from a failed musical and arranged it in a way that has been copied from Muse to Michael Bublé. She turns Ain't Got No, I Got Life from Hair into a soul-edged battle cry. This CD also contains the Groove Rider remix, which has the lyrics that were censored from the original single. And there is the always popular My Baby Just Cares About Me with its jazzy syncopated piano, and likewise the piano on I Know How It Feels to Be Free. There are many Nina Simone compilations, and it is almost impossible to find one with everything. This one does not have her passionate, angry composition Mississippi Goddamn, but does have the equally angry Cinnamon and the poignant and beautiful Young, Gifted and Black. Great singing, great piano playing, great original songs and well-chosen covers. Nina Simone, the very best of.
Big thank you to Twangling Jack Ford for this week's album review. Thank you to John Buttigieg for joining me. Thank you to everyone whose music I shared. As always, you can drop me an email here at the studio if you'd like. My email address is dane.cobain@wickhamsound.org.uk. That's dane.cobain@wickhamsound.org.uk. I always want to hear from musicians, people with MP3s I can share, as well as anybody who would like to come on and be a guest on the show. You can also find us on Facebook if you search for The Art Show on Wickham Sound, and we're repeated here on Wickham Sound on Monday nights. We're on the Wickham Sound Listen Again, we're on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. So, with all that said, that's us for another week. I'm going to leave you with one last tune, and this is Move On Up by Straight 8. I will speak to you next week.